Christ is doing in church right here and right now. For those of you who might be guests of ours, this is my second to last Sunday with Mount Carmel. Our family is one by one. Man, it's hard to watch this morning. Because it used to have a son stand up there, and one stand over here, a daughter standing up there, and just one by one, the Lord has moved them where he needed to. And then to watch my wife up here, and we sang, Jamie got to pick the songs. Thank you, Carolyn, for letting her do that. Jamie picked the songs we sang today, and she picked Open Up the Heavens because that was the first song we ever sang together with this church. That song solidified in our hearts that this is where God wanted us. Mount Carmel is not a perfect church because it's not filled with perfect people. But Mount Carmel is a loving church. It's a Christ-centered church. It's a blessed church because it's filled with loving, Christ-centered, blessed people. And for nearly 7 years, our family has been the recipient of the love and the blessing of your Christ-centeredness, and I truly want to say thank you. My last 2 Sundays with you, I just want to reflect on what the Lord has done and continues to do through the people that call Mount Carmel their home. I don't have a deep theological truth, so if you came for something like that, you're going to leave disappointed. But we are still in Exodus. Who knew? So we're going to skip quite a bit. And if you would join me in Exodus chapter number 35. Exodus chapter number 35 this morning. If you were to go back a couple of chapters, Moses is at the top of Mount Sinai for the second time. He has come down at the end of chapter 34. Moses has just come down from the top of Sinai where he received the stone tablets a second time and where he saw the glory of God. But he also received something else. In those 40 days at the top of a mountain, Moses received the instructions to building the tabernacle. Now, if you have ever gotten into Exodus, it's really good until you get to about chapter 21. Because for a number of chapters, it gets very mundane with lengths, with specific colors of things, of how something needs to be formed. It really becomes a struggle. And then Moses decides to repeat it a second time. Boy, if you didn't lose me the first time, Moses, you sure lost me the second time, right? But may I ask you a question just to consider? What do you think is more important? How God created the world with his own hands, or how God desired his people to create his tabernacle with their own hands? There's ministries, and their entire purpose is to talk about creation. You know how much time God spent on it? 2 chapters. Genesis 1 and 2. You know how many dozens of chapters God speaks about how he wants his tabernacle to look? Who is allowed to go into the tabernacle and where they're allowed to go, and what takes place both inside and around his tabernacle? Why would this be so important to God that Moses writes it down in a book, and he does it twice, and he spends the entire book of Leviticus giving us rules and laws to understand parts of the tabernacle? I think I'm not saying this is the answer, but I'm thinking this is important. Because for the first time, since the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, God is returning to dwell, to place his presence in the midst of people again. Honestly, the building of the tabernacle is a new creation story. There's so many parallels between creation and the building of the tabernacle. But this time, this creation, man takes part in it. And I think that's why these instructions are so important, because we really mess stuff up. So after coming down from Mount Sinai, Moses gathers the people together. His face is shining, if you've read this story, and he's going to share with them everything that Yahweh has just given to him. And we're going to pick it up in chapter 35, verse number 4. Chapter 35, verse number 4. And today I'm going to be reading from the New International Version for one specific reason. I'll explain it in a moment. Exodus 35, verse 4 says, Moses said to the whole Israelite community, "This is what Yahweh has commanded." Now notice these words. "From what you have, take an offering for Yahweh." And then notice these next words. "Everyone who is willing is to bring to Yahweh an offering of gold, silver, and bronze." And I'm going to stop right there. Because in verses 4 to 5, he says, we're going to take an offering, and I want you to take from what you have, and if you are willing, bring it. And then he begins to list everything they need. Verse 4 ends with, or verse 5 ends with gold, silver, and bronze. But I'm not going to read it all, but it just continues on, and it's this list of stuff that is material needs for the tabernacle to actually be built. And after he gets done making this list in verse number 10, so if you'd go to verse number 10 with me, Moses then says this, "Those of you who are skilled, all who are skilled among you, are to come and make everything Yahweh has commanded." Now here's one of the parallels. That word "make," it's the creation being retold. Because it's the same Hebrew word that Yahweh uses when he says, "Let us make man in our image." The same words he says when I will make these two great lights, one to rule the day and one to rule at night. So we're going back to creation. And he says, if you are skilled, I want you to come make a place where my glory and my presence will be. And then all the way through verse 19, and I'm not going to read it, but all the way through verse 19, he talks about things that have to be made. Here's a couple of them, and again, I'm not going to read, I'm just going to pick out a couple. The Ark of the Covenant with its poles and the atonement cover. The table with its poles, the lampstand, the altar of incense, the curtains that go in the tabernacle, an altar of burnt offering, the bronze basin where they would wash their hands, more curtains, tent pegs for the tabernacle, and then even the garments that the priests would wear as they enter the tabernacle. There's this incredible list of starting with, these are the things, material things we need, and here are the things that need to be made. So if you're skilled, please help us. And then in verse number 20, so if you look at verse 20, it says, "Then the whole Israelite community withdrew from Moses' presence." So what happens? Man, this man comes off the mountain. He's got these instructions. This is what we need. This is who we need. And everybody leaves. So what happens now? There's a pattern that we're going to see in these next couple of verses. Look at verse 21. This is after everybody left. Verse 21 says, "And everyone who was willing and whose heart moved them came and brought an offering to Yahweh for the work of the tent of meeting, for all its service and for all the sacred garments." So we see this, everyone who was willing. Now the NIV only uses willing. Other translations may say a willing heart, or there are other words for it, but this willingness is very clear. Look at verse 22. We see it again. All who were willing, or of a willing heart, men and women alike, came and brought gold jewelry of all kinds, brooches, earrings, rings, and garments. They all presented their gold as a wave offering to Yahweh. And from verse 23 through verse 25, they talk about other things that these willing people brought. Look at verse number 26 now. Verse 26. "And all the women who were willing and had the skill spun the goat hair. And so now we're seeing that the craftsmanship beginning by those who had the skill and were willing to give the skill. And verses 27 and 28 talk about more things that were brought. And then look at verse number 29. All the Israelite men and women who were willing brought to Yahweh. And notice this. Free will offerings for all the work Yahweh through Moses had commanded them to do. So wait. Is it a free will offering? Like of my own free will I'm bringing this? Or was it a command? Yeah. I think it goes back to understanding the 10 Commandments. And if you weren't here last week, forgive me, but last week we looked at how the 10 Commandments, the coming to Mount Sinai, was a marriage between Yahweh and his people. And the 10 Commandments are not, these are things you must do, but rather, this is what is important to me, what I want to be important to my bride. And so the 10 Commandments are a way that his Yahweh lives with his bride in partnership, rather than just these 10 rules we have to keep. It's very similar to our own wedding vows. I stood on a platform in Northwest Indiana 28 years ago, something like that. It's right around there. It was on October 12th. I do know that much, right? And I vowed to care for my wife, right? But here's the question. Do I live to please my wife, or do I live to keep my vows? If I truly love my wife, I will keep my vows, right? But I could keep my vows without loving my wife. That's where a lot of people live with God. They keep these rules, but they have no love for the one who they made this partnership with. And then in verse number 30, through the end of the chapter, Moses highlights some of the people who have the Spirit of God in them. And I love it. These aren't like preachers and prophets and priests going around. These are skilled men and women who can work with artistry and stonework and wood carving and create tapestries and have the ability to teach others. But it's all about this willingness. And it really seems to indicate that Yahweh is not forcing his will on people, but he's rather inviting people to partner with him according to their will. This is what God says. This is what I want to do. But because he doesn't force it on people, it leaves me, and this is me thinking it, is it possible that people have the possessions that were needed or the skills that were needed, and through a specific decision of their will chose not to give? Because it says all who were willing. It didn't say all who have stuff bring it. If you have it and if you're willing. Which means that this idea of giving, or this idea of generosity, is actually, that's the wrong one. This idea of giving or generosity is a matter of the heart. It's a matter of the affections, not a matter of possessions. Everyone has something to give. The question is my heart leading me to a place to give it? If you go back to verse number 5, Moses, remember I said keep this in mind. Moses instructed the people to bring this offering from what you have. So he wasn't saying go out and find this, go out and get a job and get it and then bring it back. He said from what you have. But remember, who are these people? Just if you've been following us with Exodus, they literally less than a year ago, probably close to 6 to 7 months ago, left Egypt as slaves. What did they have? Oh, they have a great abundance, because Yahweh had promised them when they leave Egypt, they will leave with much possessions, gold, silver, and jewelry, because Yahweh moved the hearts of the Egyptians to just say, here, you want this? You can have this. And they left with much good, which means everything that they had was a gift from Yahweh. And now he's saying, of all that I have freely given to you, are you willing to give some of that back to me? See, I would guess that there's people that go to church all over the place and they always think, well, I wish I had more to give to God. But what we fail to realize is he's already given you enough to give back to him. There's this idea that, like, if I only had more, I would give. But I'm going to tell you, that is not accurate. If you won't freely give to God when you only have a little, you won't freely give to God when you have much. I remember listening to a church podcast. It blew my mind. He said the percentage of giving of believers goes down the greater their salary rate rises. Well, because if I give God $1 out of 10, that's not that much. But to give $1,000 out of $10,000, that's $1,000 is a lot. To give $10,000 out of my $100,000 salary, that's a lot. I'd give $1 out of 10, but I'm not going to give that much. Sheesh, that thing keeps going up. It's like an alien invasion, huh? And before you try to think, I'm worried about money, you got to understand, I'm leaving. It's not about raising money. It's about revealing your heart. Because Luke chapter 12, verse 34 says, where your treasure is where your heart's going to be. I think one of my former pastors used to say, if you show me your checkbook, I'll show you your passions. Because for every one of us, we give. We give of ourselves to needs, to causes, to passions, to sports, to family, to career, to hobbies, to cars, to possessions, to clothes. We give of what we have to something. But here's the question. What do you think of as great? And I think the sad thing is most Christians, and I'm not saying it in this room, I'm saying the majority of Christians don't look at the Great Commission as being very great. Because I really believe this. When Christians view the Great Commission as truly great, the gospel will reach the ends of the world. It will. There's no doubt in my mind that God has not given his people the resources to do what he has called his people to do. The world is not being reached with the gospel, and it has nothing to do with anybody outside of the gatherings of believers. It has everything to do with believers saying, there are other things I count as greater than the Great Commission. Like my stuff, like my comfort, like my time. And the problem is, and Sam, you even mentioned it in your little testimony, we're passing that view on to the next generation. Because the next generation doesn't view the Great Commission as even being good. Because they're not even coming to church. Something stirs our heart, and whatever stirs our heart causes us to be willing to part with our time and our skills and our money and our energy. And the question is are you giving back to God what God has freely given to you? Because there's nothing you have. There's not one possession you have. There's not one talent you have. There's not one bit of energy you have. There's not one breath you will take today that isn't coming from the very hand of God. So we look in Exodus and we see these willing people. You know they got moved so much that if you were to flip to the next chapter, which I'm not going to do, but if you were to flip to the next chapter and read chapter 36, verse 5, These people that Moses put in charge of building the tabernacle had to go to Moses and say, the people are bringing too much stuff. Tell them to stop bringing their offerings. Could you imagine that sermon being preached in a church somewhere? Hey, folks, no, stop. But see, why did they respond that way? Was it because they were building a tabernacle? I don't think so, because they just heard about this. So it was brand new. They probably didn't even understand it. But why were they responding in such a way? Well, because if you realize what had just taken place is Moses had come down from the Mount Sinai the first time with these 2 tablets of the vows the people had made to Yahweh, and they were dancing on a golden calf, committing adultery and idolatry. Moses throws the tablets down saying, you've broken the very vows you just made with Yahweh. And like we said last week, what does a husband do when he finds his wife cheats on him like that? Doesn't he walk away? Say, forget, find someone else who will be faithful? Yeah, I think that's what most husbands would think of doing, but that's not what Yahweh does. He immediately calls Moses back up to the mountain, and he says, we're going to try this again. They were given a new chance at a new relationship with a God who had every reason to walk away from them. And when they realized what God was willing to do for them, they responded by saying, that's what you'll do for us. How can we then display our love for you? Recognizing God's love to us. And what he did in giving us his son, it should stir our hearts to respond in loving action to him. But here's the truth that I really, really hope you get. It does talk about the willing people, but get this. The willing people brought stuff in for the tabernacle, but everybody got to enjoy the benefits of the tabernacle, whether they were willing or not. Because that tabernacle was going to house the Ark of the Covenant, where the glory of God was going to rest in their midst. And whether they gave or didn't give, they were going to get to be beneficiaries of that. And the altar of incense and the brazen basin where the priest would raise their hand, where they would wash their hands, where the priest would put on the clothes and go prepare an offering to be given on behalf of all of Israel, the willing and the unwilling. How cool is that? I think that that's important for us to understand too, that God uses the willingness of obedient believers to bless everyone. And I'm talking like believers who are unwilling. I'm talking unbelievers. I'm talking everybody in the world benefits from those who are willing to obediently follow God, because what we're doing is we're displaying how good our God is, that we are living open-handed with what he's given us. His good and bountiful blessings are on display. And that is what Mount Carmel does week after week. And that is what the Hasse family has experienced for nearly 7 years. We've experienced this. Kenny Good. Using his skills to selflessly take care of the property, fill the baptism tank every time we have a baptism, change the air filters, check the tags on the fire extinguishers around this building, of Kevin Richards, who leads our buildings and grounds team, who will come and work at all hours, caring for needs that nobody ever sees, of Frank Pierce, who comes and he fuels up and maintains our fleet of vans, of Aaron Clark, who comes every Monday morning to count the offerings, of Carolyn Palmer, who prayerfully selects our worship music, who leads Bible studies, and a woman who just celebrates Jesus everywhere she goes, of Jeff Kibler, who will stand in the hallway every Sunday morning and talk to me about 2 things, Dr. Charles Stanley and the Dallas Cowboys, of Jim and Betty Seal, who prepare that table out in that hallway every Sunday morning for your kids, who prepare chicken dinners for our church meals. Mary Ann Hines, who would write cards for birthdays and anniversaries for so many years. Of Miss Ellen Beach, who cleaned the auditorium every Tuesday for so long. Of Rich and Shandy Sowers and Bill and Maria Copeland, the very ones that Chris mentioned earlier, who take care of those 2 to 4-year-olds and who will week after week sometimes be the only ones working down there, but there's never been a complaint. Of my friend Jay Roy, whose steadfast love for his wife through leukemia and his faithfulness to God during such a tumultuous season of his life is going to serve as an example for me until I die. Of Penny Seal, who loves these kids here at MCCA like no one else's business and spent months preparing for the crafts of VBS. Of Lisa League, who started a ladies' Bible study, and she prepares the missions updates, the ones that are in your bulletin right now. Of Aaron Weekly, who prepares his own heart, even as he mentioned it this morning, prepares his own heart for worship before he tries to point our hearts to Jesus. Of Caleb Ruthier, who, as my wife said yesterday about you, Caleb, you are an unnoticed contributor to so many people in this church that might otherwise go ignored. You make it your business to care for them. Of Dave and Judy Guzzi, who visit and encourage people behind the scenes. Of Landon and Jenny McQuillan, probably the ones who offer a helping hand quicker than anybody else that I know. Of Lynn Swartzlander and Louise Buzanka, who love and care for the little hearts of Sunday school kids. Of Frank Good, who offers wisdom to everyone and an encouragement to me every single Sunday morning. Of Miss Dorothy. Actually, I didn't have anything for you, Dorothy. But that's okay, she can't hear me anyways. Of Miss Dorothy, the one who somehow knows everything that's going on around here, and my wife said is the source of all wisdom in the church. Of a man like Ron Kaiser, who is the friendliest greeter I've ever met in my life, who helps lead the car show that has cared for so many financial contributions around here. For Teresa, who won't let me leave on a Sunday without giving me a handshake. Matt Pressgraves, and Matt, the way that you have stepped up in many areas of this church where there was a void, you have stepped in, and I want to thank you for that. For Dale and Judy Painter, who greet weekly and joyfully serve whenever there's a funeral meal. And I want to say thank you to those of you who bring meals for funerals. I stand down there every time there's a funeral, and there's the same question, are we going to have enough? And somehow God always provides because he moves the hearts of you. Julie and Kenny Ramey, who aren't going to be here these last 2 weeks, but came up to me to tell me that they have prayed for our family every day since coming to Virginia, every day. For the worship team of Bart and Lori and Crystal and Joey and Julie and Robbie and Dave and Jamie and Trinity and Adam and now Howard and Devin. And they get here early. I hope you understand. They get here really early so that they could be practiced and ready so that they can lead your hearts in worship as you slide right in. For Dave and Deb Opalka, who are burdened with many special needs children, but always encourage their kids to participate wherever they can. And I don't ever pass up Dave without him asking, Pastor, how are you doing? The van drivers of Matt and Kinley Pressgraves, Nikki and Matt Huff, Katrina Lego and Yvonne and Sophie Buracker, Carla Siegfried, Tom League, Gene and Kevin Kite, Kevin and Tamara Richards, who offer something to these kids that ride those vans that they don't get at any other time in their life. Tommy and Erica Lucas, who regularly help with baptisms. Sue Biggs, who gives me a hug every Sunday in the hallway. Miss Peggy, who keeps our finances straight, and you are the best at Southern hospitality. Jim and Renee Grandstaff, who are servants to the max, clean up after every event we have, decorate for special occasions. Our life group leaders, and specifically Johnny and Arlene. And Johnny, I don't think there's been a Sunday where we haven't talked about something that you are going to be sharing or that the Lord hasn't laid on your heart. Dave and Judy Dooley, and the way that you care for kids who nobody else really seems to notice sometimes, and you care for their moms. Of the Benegas family, who provides quality coffee for us on some Sundays. Ron and Faye Marcus, who offer honey and wooden crafts as special ways of loving people. For our AV guys, Trent and Tommy and Glenn and Jonathan and Sean, who they've got to get here early, they've got to get things ready, and they do it for us. Of Allison, who does the unseen work as the church clerk. Joe and Jane Fogel, who quietly love our missionaries. Of the nursery workers who offer moms a break and a chance for some actual adult time and to then soak up the word. And that's why those nurseries are so important. Richard and Ray Rogers, and Richard, my wife, has told me many times, you are the best storyteller. And he never misses anything. Every Saturday morning, Richard, Frank Pierce, Dave Guzzi, Johnny, they're here to pray for the needs of this church every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Daleen, the way you decorate around here and make it look beautiful and open your home. Gordon and Lynn, the bread, the Lord's Supper, the alms, the hospitality that you offer. Leading the Stephen ministry. Tamara and Lisa and Peggy caring for the missions finances that we have. Carrie and Jerica and Caitlin and Haley and Jenny caring for the nursery these last many years. Katrina, the way you decorated this stage for VBS. Miss DeShazo and keeping our kitchen spotless and clean. And Robbie and Jerica and Debbie and John and Barbara working with the youth. And thankful for our deacons as we gather regularly to pray for the needs of this church. For Pastor Mike, the prayerful wisdom and the holistic view that you have of the Christian life. For Miss Ann Vaughn, who is the church security guard because she lives up there and calls whenever anything happens in the parking lot down here. For the Swartzlanders, who they love Caleb, man. And that weekly faithfulness of caring for that boy. You can't miss that. Church, you can't miss that. Of Chris and Christine Hopkins, who lead Sunday school with the kids. And man, Chris, I'm going to miss Wednesday nights. I love those kids. And working with the Goozies and Ruthiers, the Huffs, Katrina and Yvonne and Jean, the Jenkins, the McQuillans, and Danielle. Like, that's what we've seen in the last 7 years. And I know, I could have avoided making a list because I know I left somebody off, but I didn't want to avoid making a list. If I left you off, I'm sorry, but I wanted to say thank you. It's your willingness that allows this body right here to experience the blessings that come where God dwells among us. And I want to say thank you for the front row seat. It's been good. And so I just want to give you a practical takeaway, though. Please allow the generosity and obedience of Jesus to serve as both your example, which it needs to be our example, but also our own source of our generosity and our obedience. Don't just do it because you have to do it. Let the obedience and generosity of Jesus, let that work so deeply into your life that you begin to live like him. Regularly remind your heart and remind others that every good thing in your life is from the hand of God. I really think that you could begin a life of a disciple-making journey if you simply chose one person to regularly communicate with the blessings of God. That would be a start to a true discipleship journey. Choose one person and just talk to him about what God's doing in your life every day. You know, you've probably heard the term preach the gospel and when necessary use words. That's absolutely wrong. Faith comes by hearing. You can't just do good things. You do good things and speak the truth at the same time. Saturate yourself in the gospel so that every piece of news, does this look familiar, Matt? So that every piece of news in your life is forced to pass through the filter of the good news. Meaning this. Live so deeply in the gospel that any piece of news you get has to come through this filter of the gospel that you know somehow it's going to be good news. I think most of you know this, but Jamie and I just dropped off Trinity at college, and on our way there, her car broke down at the top of a mountain, a rest area in Maryland. It was revving really high, and the brakes didn't work, so we didn't want to go down the mountain that way, right? So, man, it was so frustrating. I will be complaining to the people we get insurance from, just so you know, because they did not help whatsoever, even though it said roadside assistance. I had to call my own tow truck driver and find out where that went. It was a chaotic thing. I got back in the van as we were driving away. I'm mad. I'm frustrated, like, what's going on? And my wife, sitting next to me, says, I wonder how God's going to get glory out of this. That's not, like, what are we talking about? Like, our cars broke down. We're going to have to spend money we didn't plan to spend in a hotel, at a mechanic shop, and all this other junk. And you're thinking about how God's going to get glory out of this? And I'm like, you're too spiritual for me. Man, are you kidding? But she said that, and I thought to myself, I want to ask that question. I don't ask that question. But I want to ask that question. But you only ask that question. That's only your immediate response when something goes wrong if you have saturated your life with the good news, knowing somehow, some way, our God's so good that this is going to turn out to be good. Discover ways that your heart is stirred, and then go live that out for others. You know, something that's important to you, something that's meaningful to you, go do it for someone else. Don't wait for someone to do it for you. Go do it for someone else. Tell people when they've been a blessing to you.